I'm Emily Hayes, 32. The helicopter blades still echo in my head, not from a war zone, but from a summer morning in Arizona, when my husband laid divorce papers on the kitchen counter. "You chose the military, you lost me," he said. I thought that was the moment my life shattered, that I'd walk this path alone forever. But I was wrong. That pain, seemingly an end, was just the beginning of a new battle, a discovery of resilience, and a love I never expected. Before I tell you everything, tell me, where are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. My life in a small Tucson, Arizona apartment is neatly folded uniforms and the scent of dark roast coffee. I'm an Air Force intelligence officer, specializing in data analysis and counterterrorism strategy. The job demands precision, a cool head, and an ability to detach emotionally. Those were skills I'd learned the hard way, not on a training ground, but from my own family. My mother, a renowned social activist famous for her speeches on gender equality, always disdained my career choice. She thought I was wasting my potential and abandoning my femininity. I remember clearly the day I told them I got into the Air Force Academy. My father, a quiet, stoic Marine veteran, just nodded. But my mother, immediately, launched into a tirade about the senseless sacrifice and pitfalls of militarism. She wanted me to go to law school, to become a human rights attorney, to fit the strong woman mold she'd built for herself. Every time I came home on leave, the house was anything but a sanctuary. Dinners were filled with probing questions, with exasperated sighs when I spoke of rigorous training or lost comrades. They only saw the scars, never the steel I was forging. The subtle pressure to conform to her expectations was suffocating, a constant background hum of disapproval that chipped away at my confidence. She saw my military aspirations not as ambition, but as a direct challenge to her own carefully constructed identity of a proper woman. It wasn't just a career choice to her, it was a personal affront, a deviation from the path she had meticulously laid out for her daughter. My then husband, Michael, my high school sweetheart, gradually pulled away too. He couldn't grasp my devotion to service, calling it an unhealthy obsession that was stealing me from a normal life. His words, though softer than my mother's, landed with a similar weight, reinforcing the insidious idea that my dreams were incompatible with happiness. I felt like an anomaly, constantly trying to justify a part of myself that they simply refused to see as valid. Before the storm, there was a quiet hum, a life that seemed almost painted by numbers. Our small house in a tree-lined suburb of Savannah, Georgia, was exactly what you'd imagine from a magazine spread, a porch swaying in the breeze, the scent of jasmine heavy in the air, and Sunday mornings filled with the clatter of Michael making pancakes. He was a high school history teacher, dependable, gentle, with a laugh that crinkled the corners of his eyes. We'd met in our senior year, two kids from different sides of the tracks, drawn together by a shared dream of a simple, beautiful life. He loved my adventurous spirit, he said, the way I saw the world in shades of possibility. I loved his steady calm, his ability to make even the mundane feel significant. Our first apartment had mismatched furniture and a leaking faucet, but it hummed with our shared energy, with plans whispered late into the night. We talked about adopting a dog, about weekend road trips to forgotten towns, about the quiet joy of growing old together, still holding hands on that metaphorical porch swing. We built our days around small rituals. Morning coffee on the porch, his hand resting on my knee, the warmth seeping into my skin. Evening walks through the historic district, pointing out architectural details and imagining the lives lived behind those grand facades. We talked about future children, about renovating an old farmhouse one day, about growing old and still holding hands. There was a comfort in it, a deep, abiding peace that settled into your bones. He'd often tell me, "Emily, you're my anchor." And I believed him. I saw my military service as a part of our shared future, a means to an end. It was a path I felt called to, yes, a deep-seated pull towards purpose and contribution, but also a way to build a secure life for us, to provide opportunities we hadn't had growing up. I believed he understood that, believed he saw my ambition as a strength, not a threat. We'd spend hours talking about my deployments, his arm around me, listening intently as I described the dusty landscapes, the intense camaraderie, the quiet moments of fear and triumph. He'd bring me homemade cookies when I was home on leave, pack my favorite snacks for my return to base, and write me long, rambling letters filled with mundane details of his day, grounding me to the world I left behind. Our love felt like a sturdy, well-built ship, sailing smoothly through calm waters, the sails full of unspoken trust. The kind of ship you trust implicitly, the kind you believe will carry you through any storm, anchoring you firmly to shore when the winds pick up. But the waters, I slowly began to realize, were not as calm as they seemed. The first tiny cracks in our perfect facade were so subtle, I almost missed them, dismissing them as the natural ebb and flow of any long-term relationship. Little things. A new curtness in Michael's tone when I spoke about my next assignment, a barely perceptible tightening around his mouth. A hesitation when I asked him about his day, followed by vague, non-committal answers. His eyes would dart away, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. My mother's calls, once infrequent and easily dismissed, became almost daily, each one a subtle probing, filled with veiled questions about Michael, about my happiness, about my true purpose in life. She'd always had a way of weaving her opinions into my life, a silken thread of disapproval that was hard to cut. Now, that thread felt like a tightening noose, pulling me towards a destiny she had chosen for me. I started noticing Michael looking at me differently, not with the open adoration I was used to, but with a guarded, almost analytical gaze, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he no longer wanted to understand. He'd offer unsolicited advice, dripping with concern. "Emily, you look tired. Are you really sure this deployment is worth it? Maybe it's time to think about something more stable. Or, your mother thinks you're pushing yourself too hard.
She's just worried about you."
Maybe she's right about finding a different path." His words were soft, almost gentle, but they carried the insidious weight of a judgment I didn't understand, a subtle erosion of my choices. I'd come home from a grueling training exercise, bone-weary and craving his familiar embrace, the easy comfort of his presence, only to find him distant, engrossed in a book, or preoccupied with some trivial household task. The easy laughter, the shared silences that once spoke volumes of our connection, they were replaced by an awkward tension, a quiet space between us that grew wider with each passing day. It was like living in a house where the foundation was slowly shifting, causing hairline fractures to appear in the walls, unsettling and unnerving. My gut, that primal, undeniable instinct, began to hum with unease. I tried to shake it off, blaming my own fatigue, the stress of my job, the inevitable strains of a long-distance relationship. But the feeling persisted, a cold, persistent dread, like a shadow lengthening in the corners of my vision. I started finding excuses to stay longer at the base, to immerse myself in my work, anything to avoid the increasingly strained atmosphere at home. The comfort of our shared life began to feel like a trap, its familiarity turning into a suffocating blanket. I'd watch him across the dinner table, a stranger occupying the body of the man I loved, and wonder, who is this person? What are we becoming? Is this really the same man who once cheered my ambition? There were hushed phone calls he'd quickly end when I entered the room, his voice dropping, his posture stiffening. Late nights spent staring at his phone, a faint blue glow illuminating his face, a secretive smile playing on his lips. When I asked, he'd dismiss it as work or catching up with old friends, but the look in his eyes, a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Guilt? Fear? Something clandestine. It spoke volumes that his words denied. I found myself walking on eggshells, replaying conversations in my head, searching for a clue, a reason for this creeping coldness, this insidious withdrawal. I felt like a detective in my own life, meticulously piecing together fragments of a story I desperately didn't want to believe. The intimacy we once shared, the easy vulnerability, it had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow echo, a vast chasm where warmth once resided. The feeling wasn't of outright anger or suspicion. Not yet. It was a profound sense of loss, a gnawing certainty that something essential had shifted, irrevocably. The ground beneath me, once so solid and dependable, had begun to crumble, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. And I, unknowingly, was standing right on the very edge of a precipice, blind to the abyss opening beneath my feet. The shatter moment didn't come with a crash, but with a sickening, silent implosion. It was a Thursday. I had just returned from a 2-week field exercise, my body aching from simulated combat, my mind buzzing with the complexities of new intelligence reports. I craved the normalcy of home, the familiar weight of Michael's arms around me, the simple warmth and quiet sanctuary of our bed. Instead, I walked into a quiet house, too quiet. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, heavy with an unspoken tension that pricked at my skin. I found Michael in the living room, sitting on the edge of the sofa, a single lamp casting long, distorted shadows across his face, making him seem like a stranger. He held a sheaf of papers, neatly stacked, in his hands, his knuckles white. My heart began to thud, a heavy, frantic beat against my ribs, a warning signal I couldn't ignore. He looked up, and in his eyes I saw it. Not anger, not even sadness, but a cold, distant resolve that chilled me to the bone. It was the look of someone who had made a decision and was now detached from its consequences. "Emily," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any warmth or emotion, as if he were reading from a script, "I can't do this anymore. I'm leaving." He pushed the papers across the coffee table with a deliberate, almost dismissive gesture. "Divorce papers. My name, our names, stark black ink on crisp white sheets." The world tilted. Not violently, not with a sudden, jarring jolt, but slowly, meticulously, as if the very foundations of my existence were being dismantled, brick by agonizing brick. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't speak. The air felt thin, unbreathable, each gasp a struggle. "You chose the military. You lost me," he repeated, the words a hammer blow to my chest, delivered with a chilling lack of inflection. He didn't shout. There were no tears in his eyes, no flicker of regret, just that chilling, detached calm that spoke of calculated cruelty. He explained, in a monotone, how my career was an unhealthy obsession, how I was never really present, how he deserved a normal life, a life he claimed I was incapable of giving him. And then, he said it, almost as an afterthought, his voice tinged with a self-righteous satisfaction. "Your mother agrees. She's been very supportive. She understands what I need." It wasn't a revelation, but a devastating confirmation of the creeping dread that had been festering within me, a validation of my deepest fears. My own mother, the woman who spoke of female empowerment, and my husband, the man who swore to love me forever, conspiring to dismantle my life, to define my worth by their narrow, conventional perceptions. I stared at the papers, at the carefully worded legal jargon that sought to dissect our shared history, to invalidate years of love and sacrifice, reducing it all to a transactional severance. My mind raced, trying to grasp the enormity of it, but the meaning kept slipping away, like sand through my fingers. The silence in the room stretched, suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. I wanted to scream, to rage, to demand answers, to shake him until he became the man I once knew, the man who saw my ambition as a light, not a shadow. But the words were stuck, trapped behind a wall of unspeakable pain, a raw, primal wound opening within me. My chest tightened, a vice squeezing the air from my lungs, making each breath a ragged gasp. My vision blurred, not with tears, but with a strange, dissociative fog, a thick curtain descending between me and the horrifying reality. I felt as if I were watching a play, a tragic drama unfolding on a distant stage, and I was merely an unwilling, passive audience member, unable to intervene in my own demise. Every memory, every shared laugh, every intimate whisper, replayed in my mind, now tainted, twisted into something ugly and false, a cruel illusion. Was it all a lie? Was I so blind, so naive, to have missed the rot festering beneath the surface, the insidious decay that had been slowly consuming our foundation? The betrayal wasn't just his leaving. It was the quiet, insidious erosion of trust, the calculated manipulation, the alliance with the one person who had always subtly undermined my choices. It was the shattering realization that the life I had built, the love I had poured my heart into, was not what I believed it to be. It was a house of cards, meticulously constructed, collapsing in on itself, leaving only debris, dust, and an echoing emptiness. I rose slowly, my limbs heavy, disconnected from my will, as if I were moving through thick water. My voice, when it finally came, was a whisper, raspy and unfamiliar, a mere breath against the enormity of the silence. "You don't understand." I managed to choke out, the words tasting like ash. He didn't respond. He simply averted his gaze, a subtle flinch that confirmed his complicity, his shame, his cowardice. That was when the true collapse began. Not with a sob or a scream, but with a profound, internal tremor, a seismic shift deep within my core. The world I knew, the world I trusted, ceased to exist. In its place, a desolate landscape, barren and cold, stretched out before me. I was adrift, untethered, watching my life shatter into a million irreparable pieces. The quiet in that room was the loudest sound I had ever heard, the sound of a heart breaking, not with a dramatic crack, but with a silent, devastating crumple, leaving only rubble behind. The quiet after the shatter was a strange kind of peace, not a comforting one, but a desolate, empty expanse. There was no screaming, no tears, not in the way one might expect. Just a profound, aching silence that settled deep in my bones. I moved through the days like a ghost, a hollow shell inhabiting my own life. My apartment, once a haven of shared dreams, became a stark reminder of what was lost, each empty space echoing with absence. Yet, in that emptiness, a flicker, almost imperceptible at first, began to stir. It wasn't anger. It wasn't a thirst for revenge. It was something colder, more deliberate. A quiet resolve, a fierce, protective instinct for what little remained of myself.
I stopped talking about it.
To anyone. The divorce proceedings were a blur of legalese and Michael's increasingly public accusations. He, with my mother's persistent guidance, turned the courtroom into a stage for his self-pitying drama. He painted me as heartless, work-obsessed, unfit for motherhood, even though we had no children, all because of my military schedule. My mother sat in the gallery, head held high, a look of performative pity on her face, mouthing platitudes to reporters outside the courthouse. A woman should know her limits, especially when it impacts family happiness. Each word was a barb, a fresh wound, but I felt oddly detached, as if watching a story unfold about someone else's tragedy. The emotional well had run dry. There was nothing left to give, no tears left to cry, no anger left to fuel a fight. Instead, I observed. I watched Michael's theatrical pronouncements, his exaggerated sighs, the way he would glance at my mother for approval, like a child seeking validation. I watched my mother's carefully constructed facade of concern, the way her eyes gleamed with a self-righteous satisfaction, a triumph over my supposed, misguided choices. I saw the calculated cruelty, the deliberate attempt to strip me of my dignity, not just my marriage. And in that cold observation, a quiet strength began to gather, an unshakable certainty. This wasn't about me anymore, not truly. This was about them, about their need for control, for validation, for a narrative that made them feel superior, at my expense. I started planning. Not grand schemes of retribution, but small, precise moves, like a chess player strategizing their next, inevitable move. I meticulously organized my finances, separating every shared asset, ensuring I left no loose ends, no lingering ties to their toxic web. I consulted with my legal team, not to fight, but to protect myself, to build an impenetrable shield around my future, around my very essence. I immersed myself in my work, using the rigorous demands of my intelligence role as a crucible, a forge for my shattered spirit. The complex data analysis, the strategic planning, the cold, logical detachment required to dissect threats, these became my refuge, my anchor in the storm of personal turmoil. My mind, once consumed by emotional turmoil, became a finely tuned instrument of precision, sharper and more focused than ever before. I spent hours in the base library, researching, learning. Not just legal strategies, but also about self-preservation, about rebuilding from nothing, about the psychology of manipulation and resilience. I learned to track patterns, to anticipate movements, to understand the motivations behind actions, even when those actions were deeply personal and devastating. I began to see my life, not as a broken artifact, a tragic mistake, but as a complex project in need of careful, calculated reconstruction, a mission I was uniquely qualified to undertake. Each small victory, each piece of control reclaimed, was a silent testament to my burgeoning strength. The quiet planning was a form of self-preservation, a silent declaration of war against the chaos that threatened to consume me. Every choice, every action, was imbued with a new purpose: to reclaim control, to reconstruct my sense of self, piece by deliberate piece. The seed of transformation had been planted, not with a burst of fiery emotion, but with a quiet, determined turning of a key, unlocking a strength I never knew I possessed. The turn was not a dramatic confrontation, but a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the wind, like the precise movement of a chess piece that changes the entire board. It happened in the courtroom, during what was meant to be Michael's final, triumphant flourish, his moment of unassailable victimhood. He had just finished a lengthy, tearful monologue about my supposed abandonment, painting himself as the innocent victim of my unhealthy military obsession. He spoke of his loneliness, his sacrifices, his desire for a normal family life that my career had supposedly denied him. My mother, predictably, dabbed at her eyes in the gallery, a performance perfected over years. The judge, a stern, unreadable woman with tired eyes, looked utterly weary of the theatrics. When it was my turn, I didn't engage with his accusations. I didn't defend my choices, or plead for understanding. I didn't utter a single word about his character or his failings. Instead, I stood, deliberately, with a quiet dignity that was more powerful than any shouted defense. With slow, measured movements, I unpinned the rank from my uniform, the gleaming silver eagle catching the harsh courtroom lights, reflecting a cold, bright truth. I placed it gently on the table before me, not with anger, but with a quiet finality. The small click of metal on wood echoed in the suddenly silent room, a sound disproportionately loud in the sudden vacuum of sound. Then, I looked Michael squarely in the eye, my gaze unwavering, devoid of either anger or pity, just an empty space where emotion used to reside. My voice was low, steady, without a tremor of emotion, cutting through the stunned silence. "This isn't my problem," I said, the words falling like precisely placed stones. "This is yours." The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The air crackled with a sudden, unexpected tension, a shift in the very atmosphere. It was not an act of defiance or of anger, but of complete, utter detachment, a disavowal of his narrative. It was the quiet, undeniable assertion of self, the reclaiming of my narrative from those who sought to define it, to diminish it. Michael's carefully constructed facade of victimhood crumbled. His jaw dropped, and for the first time, I saw genuine shock, not theatrical despair, in his eyes. My mother, usually so composed, stiffened, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning realization. They had expected a fight, tears, a breakdown, a validation of their performance. They had expected a victim. What they got was silence, and a woman who refused to play their game, a woman who had simply walked away from the chessboard. The judge, who had been impassive throughout the proceedings, leaned forward almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something resembling respect, or perhaps recognition in her eyes. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The power had subtly, unequivocally, transferred. The revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't about destroying Michael's reputation, though I knew the public spectacle he had created would now, ironically, reflect poorly on him. It was about exposing the hollow core of his accusations, about showing, without a single shouted word, that his problems were his own, stemming from his own insecurities and moral failings, not from my choices or my dreams. It was dignified, earned, a quiet victory of self-possession over manipulation. The judge's final ruling was surprisingly equitable, stripping away much of the leverage Michael and my mother had tried to secure through their public shaming. It was a legal victory, yes, but more importantly, it was a profound personal one. The act of unpinning my rank was a silent declaration. My service, my identity, my very being was not something they could shame me for or take away. It was mine, and mine alone, a part of me that was utterly untouchable by their judgment. The fallout was a slow burn, not a sudden explosion of immediate retribution. Michael's carefully constructed public image, so meticulously curated by my mother's constant influence, began to unravel. The local news, initially sympathetic to his plight, captivated by the drama of the wronged husband, started to question his motives, digging deeper into the specifics of his claims. My quiet defiance in court, the stark contrast to his dramatic, almost histrionic outbursts, seemed to resonate with the public in an unexpected way. There were whispers, then articles, dissecting the details of his accusations, highlighting the lack of concrete evidence and the emotional manipulation. People started to see through the veneer, the performative pity. His students, once admiring, and even some of his colleagues, began to distance themselves, sensing the underlying currents of deceit. I heard through mutual acquaintances that his new relationship, supposedly a beacon of normalcy and forged in the very fires of our divorce, was already showing significant cracks, unable to withstand the pressure of his exposed character. The narrative he had so meticulously crafted of the innocent, abandoned husband was turning on him, a karmic boomerang. He began to feel the true, suffocating weight of his actions, not because I sought retribution or lifted a finger against him, but because the truth, in its own quiet, undeniable way, always finds a path to the surface, and consequences, like gravity, eventually catch up. Meanwhile, I began the arduous, essential work of healing. It wasn't linear, not a simple path to recovery. There were days when the ghost of betrayal would resurface, a cold tremor in my chest, a sudden wave of doubt. But each time, I met it with a quiet resilience, a recognition that it was a scar, a faded mark, not an open wound that bled anew. I returned to base with a renewed sense of purpose, my commitment to service stronger than ever. The uniform felt less like a costume and more like a second skin, a testament to my true self, a symbol of the strength I had forged. I immersed myself in my intelligence work, finding solace in the precision, the logic, the undeniable facts that offered a stark contrast to the emotional chaos of my recent past. The complex problems I solved on duty provided a structure, an order, that helped me to rebuild the internal landscape of my own life. I joined a support group for female veterans, hesitant at first, unsure if I could bear to share my raw wounds, but desperate for connection beyond the military bubble. It was a small circle of women, some with visible scars from combat, others with the kind of invisible wounds that only show in the eyes, in a subtle flinch, in a quiet understanding. We didn't need flowery words or elaborate explanations of our personal lives. Just presence and listening. We talked about deployments, about the unique challenges of being women in a male-dominated world, about the quiet battles we fought long after we left the combat zone, the insidious wounds of emotional warfare back home. We shared stories of betrayal, of loss, of finding strength in unexpected places, of being misunderstood by those who never walked our path. In their eyes, I saw understanding, not judgment, empathy that bypassed the need for explanation. We lifted each other up, not with grand gestures, but with quiet nods, shared cups of coffee that tasted like comfort, and the unspoken understanding of shared experience, of having walked through fire and emerged, changed but not broken. These women, These sisters in arms became my chosen family, a sanctuary where my worth was never questioned, only affirmed, where my strength was celebrated, not critiqued. Slowly, quietly, I reclaimed my life, piece by deliberate piece. The small apartment in Tucson became a true home, filled not with perfect family photos of a life that was never truly mine, but with military memorabilia, framed letters from comrades, and a growing collection of books on stoicism, leadership, and resilience. These were the true testaments to a life I was building myself, not on the spotlight or others' fickle validation, but on the bedrock of my own strength and the chosen connections that truly mattered. The constant need for approval, the desperate yearning for my mother's acceptance, for Michael's validation, it faded, like a distant echo, replaced by an inner peace, a deep, quiet certainty. I learned to trust my own judgment implicitly, to listen to my own gut feelings, to validate my own choices, free from the external noise. The invisible scars remained, a reminder of the battles fought and the lessons learned, but they no longer defined me. They had shaped me, refined me, made me stronger, more compassionate, and undeniably, irrevocably my own. I was not whole because I had forgotten the pain, but because I had integrated it, understood its lessons, and moved beyond its limiting grasp. Closure arrived, not with a fanfare or a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet exhale, a soft release of the past. I didn't seek it from Michael or my mother, for I knew they could offer nothing that would truly heal me. I found it within myself, in the quiet strength that had bloomed in the aftermath of devastation. The bitterness had faded, like a shadow at noon, replaced by a profound sense of clarity and an unexpected lightness of spirit. The hurt had transformed into an unshakable inner core, a resilient spirit that no external force could ever shatter again. I was free, truly free, not because I had forgotten the betrayal, for its lessons were etched into my very being, but because I had outgrown the pain it inflicted. It no longer held power over me. There was no drama, no lingering desire for retribution, no need for their acknowledgement, just a deep, abiding peace that settled comfortably into my soul. My life was no longer defined by what was lost, by the gaping void of their absence, but by what I had built, brick by deliberate brick, with my own hands and my own unwavering resolve. I had learned that your worth isn't found where you were born, but where you choose to stand. And I stood, firm and unyielding, on my own ground, in my own truth, ready for whatever lay ahead. Have you found your way back from betrayal?